everyone. It's great to be with you. Thanks for coming out. Just before we start, I'm going to give you as much as I can in the time that we have. It's a huge subject, as you can imagine. And then those of you who want more, my contact details are on the front there. So moving on, before we get started to talk about how to support our grieving clients, myths, evidence, and some very practical tips, I wonder if I could please just ask you quickly who's on the call in terms of your background as veterinary nurses.
That's great, Caroline.
I'm having trouble. Sorry, Anthony, to interrupt you. I'm having trouble forwarding my presentation, so
yeah,
I've
just taken over the poll now, okay. So I will read those out to the attendees. We've got a qualified VN with at least 10 years experience of practice, qualified VN with less than 10 years, vet with at least 10 years experience of practice, or vet with less than 10 years experience of practice, and then other. So, just vote away, and we can, I'll give you a few more seconds, and we can then pass those results on to you, Caroline.
Thanks, Anthony.
One of the disadvantages is that you don't see this because you're blocked out of it, so you just have to take my word for it, Caroline.
Sure.
I won't tell you any tips, I promise.
Don't worry. And Anthony, just so I've understood everything correctly, will I be able to forward everything once the poll is over?
Yes.
Because at the moment, good.
Yes, it should be fine.
Fantastic. Thank you.
We'll have a look at that if there's a problem, and we can get that sorted out. So, closing the poll now, and we have 7% are qualified VNs with at least 10 years experience. 0% qualified with less than 10 years experience. 72% of the vets on the call have at least 10 years experience. 19% with less than 10 years experience, and there are 2% other, which probably slightly takes us over 100%, but of course it just averages things up. But that's so 7% with VNs over 10 years, 72% vets over 10 years, 19 less than 10 years, and then 2% others.
That's great. And I'm sorry, Anthony, I'm not having any choice.
You should be able to forward them there. There should be just at the very bottom.
Oh, hang on, there we go.
There we go, and you just click that, and that should get us moving. Okay.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for letting me know where you all are in the veterinary nursing and veterinary profession, and thanks for your patience with these couple of hiccups at the start. So it sounds as if the majority of you are like me. I qualified in this case in 1986, so and when I talk to colleagues of my vintage and younger, we all agree none of us has a file at home that says the whole euthanasia consultation, the background to it, and then the grief that follows. What we're going to talk about tonight is more about the grief than the how to, what to say when in the euthanasia consult. And we're going to start by just reviewing some theory about grief and recent research on grief for companion animals. And then I want to hone in on some myths or some popular assumptions that we have in veterinary practice and see how that stacks up against the evidence. And finally get down to practicalities. How can we further support our clients? What are some simple tools that tomorrow, as soon as you get back into practice next day, that you can start incorporating if you aren't already? So let's get stuck into the theory. What is grief? What is grief? And grief is the psychological, behavioral, and social reaction that we have to loss, and in particular to the loss of a strong attachment figure. And what do we mean by that? Well, as human beings, we're a social species, and of course, from the moment we're born, it's adaptive to form strong bonds of attachment to caregivers who then become a source of reliability and care and comfort for us and enable us to grow up and to thrive. And that tendency is formed in our young sort of babyhood, early childhood, and then stays with us throughout our adult life. Attachment theory is a very big part of the understanding of our human behavior, our human interactions, and sure enough it applies broadly to our interactions with our companion animals as well. And there isn't time to get into that tonight, but en passant, our style of attachment affects how we might grieve for our pets. But the reason that we form these strong connections with companion animals is because we naturally are predisposed to have strong attachments. And of course our companion animals give us a sense of comfort and security usually. They don't talk back, they seem to accept us as we are no matter what, and they're happy with the simple things in life and they're pleased to see us and they give us a routine. So when all of that suddenly comes to an end, and not only when an animal dies, but also when perhaps we have to give them up or they disappear, the grieving process gets set off automatically for most of us. So that's why our clients are grieving. And grief is a normal coping response. It's a normal response. It enables us to adapt to life without the attachment figure. So it isn't something that we should be feeling on top of everything else that we do for our patients and for our clients, that somehow now we've got to suddenly fix their grief or be a problem solver for their grief. Apart from the fact we don't have the skills to do that, even if we did, it would be wrong of us to try and interrupt someone's grief or jolly them along and help them to get through it and get over it and so forth. And that could be something that, if we're not careful, we might inadvertently tend to do for people, meaning well, but it's probably not the best thing to be doing. To say, you'll feel better about it soon, and you'll get over it quicker than you think, or those kinds of things. Because grief takes its own course for each individual, and it's affected by many different things. But before we get on to the factors that affect it, the next thing to remember is that grief does not follow a tidy step-by-step sequence. And you hear about, the stages of grief, the 5 stages of grief, and denial, and then anger, and bargaining, and then depression, and finally acceptance. And that isn't really an up-to-date or strictly accurate way to describe grief as we now understand it. That model was developed by a pioneer in death studies, if you like, a psychiatrist called Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And she was concerned about how to help those with terminal diagnoses, or those who are reaching the end of their life by virtue of old age as well. How are we to help others who are dying? How are we to help them to face their death? And she came up from her observations and conversations with patients and from research with this structure that those people would typically go through. And that model has been adapted for the bereaved, so for those of us left behind who are coming to terms with the death. And it's certainly had its place, but when you look at the human bereavement literature, there's a very strong sense that this isn't really an appropriate or fitting, it's not an adequate description of what grief is like. Because grief is typically some kind of roller coaster of different feelings. And there have been other models of grief that have been developed, and there isn't time to go into those either. But one which I would like to put to you, which is perhaps the most recent one, which compiles ideas from a couple of the earlier ones and has then been applied to people who are struggling with grief to develop this very practical template for bereavement counsellors in practice. And let's just take a couple of minutes to go through that. It's the range of response to loss model of grief. And it was developed by Linda Machin as part of her PhD thesis arising out of her work as a grief counsellor and someone who worked with the bereaved. The first thing to say about it is that we don't have any kind of a proven model of response to loss for animal companions. So I'm not saying this is definitively what we see in practice, but as I go through it, I'm proposing it to you as something that certainly makes sense to me empirically. I returned to first opinion practice in 2008, having been an academic for some years before, and as I was working with grieving clients, as we all are, this seemed to make sense. So let's just go through it. Left to right, broadly 2 styles of response to loss. One on the left, overwhelmed, and with those people, their feelings of grief are very strong, so they have strong emotions and they often express them. And on the other side, we've got the controlled style of response to loss. And for those people, their way of coping is to keep emotions in check and not to display them. Their way of coping is to maintain normal everyday action, keep thinking normally and acting normally. And there's nothing right or wrong with either of those. They're simply different styles of response. They do probably relate to our styles of attachment, and that's a whole other discussion that's out with today's talk. But where the proverbial rubber meets the road is, given your natural style of response to loss, are you as an individual resilient or are you vulnerable? And that's the north-south axis there that we see. So someone who would be resilient would have a set of personal and circumstantial